The silent disruption. The morning sun painted streaks of golden light across the city as Judge Althea Morgan approached the courthouse. Known for her unshakable integrity and profound commitment to justice, Althea had become an unyielding beacon in her community. Her journey to the bench was a testament to resilience. Countless late nights in law school, navigating systemic hurdles, and proving her worth in a field where she was often underestimated. Today, however, a confrontation awaited her that would test her resolve in ways she had never anticipated. Althea stepped out of her car, clutching her judicial robe over her arm, her heels clicking purposefully against the pavement. The courthouse was alive with its usual buzz. Attorneys juggling briefcases, clerks shuffling papers, and citizens bustling about their daily civic duties. It was a scene of organized chaos that Althea found oddly comforting. This was her domain, a place where truth was pursued and justice rendered. As she neared the grand marble steps, her sharp eyes caught sight of a man standing rigidly by the entrance. He was a white police officer, mid-30s, with a broad build and a hard-set jaw. There was an air about him that set her on edge, a tension that seemed to hum in the space between them. His eyes met hers, narrowing with suspicion. "Ma'am, stop right there," he barked, his tone sharp and commanding. Althea slowed her pace, her brows knitting together in confusion. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with authority. She was used to respect, especially at this courthouse where she presided as a judge. Encounters with officers were typically marked by polite exchanges or brief nods of acknowledgement. This was different. "You can't go in," he said, stepping in front of her and blocking her path. His stance was rigid, his hand resting on his belt. "You don't belong here." The words hit her like a slap. For a moment, Althea was too stunned to respond. She looked at the man, her judicial robe still draped over her arm, and then at the growing crowd of onlookers. Faces turned toward them, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disbelief. "Officer," Althea began, keeping her voice steady, "I am Judge Althea Morgan. I preside in this courthouse." The officer's eyes flickered for the briefest moment. Was that recognition? Before his jaw set tighter. "I don't care who you say you are," he replied, his voice laced with contempt. "You're not going in." Althea's heart quickened, but her demeanor remained poised. She had spent years in courtrooms where tempers flared and egos clashed, mastering the art of composure. This man would not rattle her, no matter how blatant his disrespect. "Officer," she said evenly, "I suggest you step aside. This courthouse is not your personal gate to guard." The officer sneered, taking the small but deliberate step forward. "You're not welcome here," he muttered, his voice low but no less venomous. The crowd around them had thickened. Clerks, attorneys, and civilians stood frozen, their morning routines interrupted by the unfolding drama. Althea scanned the faces in the crowd. Some recognized her, their shock evident, but no one moved to intervene. Althea's mind raced. She could feel the weight of history pressing on her shoulders, the echoes of countless others who had faced this same venom in different forms. This was about more than her. It was about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. She took a step closer, narrowing the distance between them. "I am walking into this courthouse," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "And if you think your badge gives you the right to deny me entry, you are mistaken." The officer's hand moved instinctively toward his holstered weapon, and the crowd gasped audibly. Althea didn't flinch. She stood rooted, her presence commanding. Just then, a voice rang out from the courthouse doors. "What's going on here?" The crowd parted as an older officer approached. His uniform was slightly worn, his posture that of someone who had seen decades on the force. His eyes darted from Althea to the younger officer, his face hardening as recognition dawned. "Judge Morgan," he said, his tone respectful. "Is there a problem?" "This officer seems to think I don't belong in my own courthouse," Althea replied, her voice unwavering. The senior officer turned to his subordinate, his expression darkening. "Step aside," "Officer Laird," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. For a moment, Laird hesitated, his defiance visible. But under the weight of his superior's gaze, he relented, stepping back. His face was a storm of anger and embarrassment. But he said nothing. Althea didn't spare him another glance as she ascended the steps, her chin held high. The crowd began to disperse, murmurs rippling through the air like distant thunder. Inside the courthouse, the familiar marble halls greeted her, but the sense of safety and order she usually felt was absent. Today, she had seen the rot beneath the surface. That evening, as Althea sat in her quiet home, the events of the day replayed in her mind. She had faced countless moments of discrimination in her life, but this one lingered heavy and unresolved. It wasn't just about her. It was about a system that allowed such behavior to persist. She glanced at her phone. There were messages from colleagues expressing their shock and support, but one caught her eye. It was from Marcus Carter, a young attorney she had mentored, known for his fiery passion for justice. "Judge Morgan, you've always told me to fight the battles that matter. Maybe it's time for us to fight this one together." Althea read the message twice before setting her phone down. Marcus was right. This wasn't just her fight, it was everyone's. And if this system thought it could silence her, it had another thing coming. She would fight, not with anger, but with the sharp precision of someone who knew how to wield the law. This battle was far from over. It was just beginning. Shadows beneath the law. The next day dawned cold and gray, casting an eerie pall over the city. Judge Althea Morgan sat in her chambers, the morning's light filtering through the frosted glass windows. Outside, the courthouse buzzed with activity, but Althea's focus was elsewhere. Her desk was laden with files, but her mind kept returning to the events of the previous day. The confrontation with Officer Laird had ignited something within her, a simmering determination to confront not just one man's prejudice, but the system that had emboldened him. The courthouse had always been her sanctuary, a place where logic and fairness were supposed to prevail. Yet yesterday's events had shattered that illusion. Althea leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the photograph on her desk. It was a picture of her father, a civil rights attorney who had fought tirelessly for justice in his time. His quiet strength and relentless resolve had been her guiding light. She wondered what he would say now, faced with a challenge so personal yet so universal. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," she called, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. The door opened to reveal Marcus Carter, the young attorney she had mentored since his early days at law school. He entered with his usual energy, but today his movements were deliberate, his expression serious. "Judge Morgan," he greeted, his tone formal. "I'm glad you had time to meet with me." "Marcus," Althea replied, gesturing for him to sit. "What brings you here so early?" He took the seat across from her, leaning forward with urgency. "I heard what happened yesterday. Everyone's talking about it. Staff, attorneys, even some of the officers. What that man did to you it's beyond unacceptable." Althea nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It was more than a personal insult, Marcus. It's a symptom of a larger problem, one that we've both been fighting against for years." Marcus's hands tightened into fists on the edge of the desk. "And yet it keeps happening. We keep fighting, but nothing changes." Althea studied him for a moment. He was young, idealistic, and full of fire, qualities she admired but knew could burn too brightly without focus. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said gently. "You know that as well as I do. But it can't just be business as usual," Marcus insisted, his voice rising with passion. "This isn't just another case of systemic racism we can analyze from a distance. It happened to you. At this courthouse. In front of everyone." Althea folded her hands on the desk, her gaze unwavering. "What do you suggest we do?" Marcus hesitated, as though weighing the gravity of his words. "We make it public," he said finally. "This isn't just about Officer Laird. It's about the culture that allowed someone like him to feel empowered to act that way. We use this moment to force a conversation, to demand accountability. Althea leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing in thought. It wasn't a bad idea, but it wasn't without risks. Going public would mean exposing herself to scrutiny, potentially becoming the target of backlash from those who didn't want the system disrupted. But the alternative, silence, was a price she wasn't willing to pay. Before she could respond, another knock came at the door. This time, it was Henry Briggs, the courthouse administrator. His expression was pinched, his usually polished demeanor frayed. "Judge Morgan," he began, his voice clipped. "Do you have a moment?" Althea nodded, gesturing for him to join them. "Come in, Henry. We were just discussing yesterday's incident." Briggs's face darkened. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "That's precisely why I'm here. The situation has escalated." Althea's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "There's been a report filed against you," Briggs said, his tone carefully neutral. "By Officer Laird." The room fell silent. Marcus straightened in his chair, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger. "A report? Against Judge Morgan? For what?" Briggs sighed, adjusting his tie nervously. "He's claiming that you were aggressive and uncooperative during your interaction. He's accusing you of attempting to enter the courthouse without proper identification and causing a public disturbance." Althea felt a cold wave of disbelief wash over her. "That's absurd," she said, her voice low but firm. "I had my judicial robe in hand. Everyone who works in this courthouse knows who I am." Briggs nodded. "I believe you, Judge Morgan. But the report has already made its way to the department, and they're treating it seriously. There's talk of an internal review." Marcus slammed his hand on the desk, startling both Althea and Briggs. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he exclaimed. "He's trying to turn this around, to make it about you instead of his blatant racism." Althea raised a hand, calming Marcus with a look. "Anger won't help us here," she said. "We need to be strategic." Briggs shifted uncomfortably. "I'm on your side, Judge. But you should know, the media has already caught wind of the incident. Reporters have been calling all morning, asking for comments." Althea's jaw tightened. The situation was spiraling faster than she had anticipated. If the media was involved, this would no longer be a private matter. Every detail would be scrutinized, twisted, and debated in the court of public opinion. "Thank you, Henry," she said finally. "Please keep me informed of any new developments." Briggs nodded, his expression weary. "Of course. And if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." As he left, Marcus turned to Althea, his eyes blazing. "This is your chance," he said. "You've spent your entire career fighting for justice. Now you can fight for yourself, and for everyone else who's ever been in your shoes." Althea sat silently for a moment, her mind racing. He was right. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had faced discrimination and been silenced. She had the platform, the voice, and the courage to challenge the system, and she would. "Contact the press," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'll make a statement tomorrow." Marcus's eyes lit up with determination. "I'll draft a press release. We'll make sure they hear your side of the story." As he left to begin his preparations, Althea leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she was ready. She had spent her life fighting for justice. This time, the fight was personal, and she intended to win. The fire within. The next morning, Judge Althea Morgan woke before sunrise. She sat by her window, sipping her coffee as the city stirred to life. The air felt heavy, laden with the weight of what lay ahead. Today would mark a turning point, not just for her, but for the courthouse and the community it served. Her decision to go public with her experience was a bold one, but she knew it was necessary. Silence was no longer an option. By the time she arrived at the courthouse, reporters had already begun to gather outside. Cameras flashed, and microphones thrust forward as soon as her car door opened. Althea stepped out, her judicial robe draped over her arm, her head held high. The questions came fast and loud. Judge Morgan, what's your response to the allegations against you? Do you think this will impact your career? What are your thoughts on systemic racism within the justice system? Althea raised a hand, her calm demeanor silencing the crowd. I will be addressing these matters shortly, she said. Thank you for your patience. Inside the courthouse, Marcus Carter was waiting for her, a file folder clutched tightly in his hands. He looked tense but resolute. Everything's ready, he said as they walked toward her chambers. I've coordinated with a few trusted journalists to ensure your statement reaches the right ears. This isn't just about yesterday. It's about changing the narrative. Althea nodded. Good. Let's make sure this is done the right way. Once inside her chambers, she reviewed the statement Marcus had prepared. It was powerful yet measured, highlighting her personal experience while tying it to the broader issue of systemic inequality. She made a few adjustments, ensuring her voice came through clearly. As the clock struck 10, Althea and Marcus headed to the press conference, set up in the courthouse's main hall. The room was packed with reporters, courthouse staff, and members of the public. The air buzzed with anticipation. Althea stepped up to the podium, her presence commanding. She scanned the crowd, taking a moment to meet the eyes of those gathered before her. Then she began. Good morning, she said, her voice steady. My name is Judge Althea Morgan, and I have served this community with pride and dedication for over a decade. Yesterday, I experienced something that no one, especially someone in my position, should ever have to face. I was stopped at the steps of this very courthouse by an officer who questioned my right to be here, not because of my actions, but because of my appearance. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Althea pressed on. What happened yesterday was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a deeper issue, one that has plagued our institutions for far too long. Racism, whether overt or subtle, undermines the very foundation of justice. It creates barriers where there should be none, and it fosters distrust where there should be respect. She paused, letting her words sink in. I am speaking out today not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel unwelcome in a place they had every right to be. For every person who has been judged not by their character or their actions, but by the color of their skin. This must stop, and it must stop now. The room erupted into applause, but Althea wasn't finished. I am calling for a thorough investigation into the actions of Officer Laird, as well as a review of the policies and training procedures within our law enforcement agencies. Accountability is not optional. It is a requirement for a just society. As she stepped back from the podium, the reporters surged forward with more questions. Althea held her ground, answering some while deflecting others with the grace of someone well-versed in handling pressure. Marcus stood by her side, offering quiet support. Once the press conference ended, Althea returned to her chambers. She felt a sense of relief, but also a simmering tension. The battle had just begun, and she knew there would be backlash. As if on cue, her phone buzzed with a series of notifications. Messages of support poured in from colleagues, community members, and even strangers. But mixed in were the first signs of opposition. One message caught her eye. It was from an anonymous sender, and it read, "Keep your mouth shut, Judge, or you'll regret it." Althea's stomach tightened, but she refused to let fear take hold. She forwarded the message to Marcus, who arrived within minutes, his face dark with concern. "This is a threat," he said bluntly. "We need to report this." Althea shook her head. "We will, but not today. Right now, we focus on the bigger picture. Let them try to intimidate me. I've faced worse." Marcus hesitated, but nodded. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," she assured him. "But we can't let this distract us. They want us to be afraid, to back down. We won't give them that satisfaction." As the day wore on, Althea immersed herself in her work, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of the courtroom. But beneath her calm exterior, a fire burned brighter than ever. She had taken the first step in a long journey. and there was no turning back. That evening, as she sat in her quiet home, she reflected on the day's events. The press conference had been a success, but it was only the beginning. The message she had received was a stark reminder of the resistance she would face. Yet, Althea was undeterred. She had spent her life fighting for justice, and she would continue to do so, no matter the cost. For the first time in years, she felt a profound sense of purpose. This was her fight, but it was also the fight of countless others. And together, they would forge a path toward a better future. The fire within her would not be extinguished. The resistance unfolds. The next few days were a whirlwind of media coverage, courthouse buzz, and an undercurrent of tension that seemed to pervade every interaction Judge Althea Morgan had. Her statement had sent ripples far beyond the walls of the courthouse. It was being dissected on news channels, debated on social media, and discussed in hushed tones by her peers. The response was overwhelming, both supportive and antagonistic. In her chambers, Althea sat at her desk, reviewing case files, but her focus kept slipping. Every buzz of her phone brought another wave of emotion. Messages of solidarity, messages of hatred, and the occasional chilling threat. Marcus Carter had insisted on involving the police regarding the anonymous threats, but Althea had been resistant. She knew from experience that the battle she had stepped into was as much about perception as it was about action. Reporting the threats would only fan the flames and risk making her look vulnerable. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," she called, expecting Marcus. Instead, it was Henry Briggs, the courthouse administrator. He looked more frazzled than usual, his tie slightly askew. "Judge Morgan," he began, closing the door behind him. "I need to talk to you about something delicate." Althea gestured for him to sit, leaning back in her chair. "Go ahead, Henry." He hesitated, his hands fidgeting with his tie. "There's been pressure," he admitted, "from certain officials. They're not happy with the attention this situation is bringing to the courthouse and to the city." Althea's brow furrowed. "Pressure? From whom?" Henry's eyes darted away, his discomfort evident. "The mayor's office. Some members of the police department. They're concerned about the narrative you're creating." Althea's lips pressed into a thin line. "The narrative I'm creating," she repeated, her tone sharp. "This isn't a narrative, Henry. It's the truth." "I know that," he said quickly, "but they don't see it that way. They're saying this could harm public trust in the justice system. They're worried it'll spiral out of control." Althea leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "And what do they want me to do? Apologize for telling the truth? Pretend that what happened didn't happen?" Henry shifted uncomfortably. "No one's asking you to lie, Judge Morgan, but they're hoping you'll temper your public statements. Keep things contained." Althea's jaw tightened. "So they want me to stay silent." Henry didn't respond, but his silence was answer enough. Althea felt a surge of frustration, but she forced herself to remain calm. This wasn't unexpected. She had seen this kind of pushback before. People in power more concerned with maintaining the status quo than addressing the rot beneath it. "Thank you for letting me know, Henry," she said finally. "But I'm not going to stop speaking out. If anything, this only reinforces why it's so important." Henry sighed, standing to leave. "I figured you'd say that. Just be careful, Judge Morgan. They're not going to make this easy for you." As the door closed behind him, Althea took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't naive. She knew the risks of standing up to a system that had long resisted change. But she also knew that backing down now would mean letting fear win. And that was not an option. That afternoon, Marcus burst into her chambers, his face alight with urgency. "Judge Morgan, you need to see this," he said, holding out his phone. Althea took the phone, her eyes scanning the screen. It was a social media post, an unflattering photo of her taken during the press conference, accompanied by a string of baseless accusations. It claimed she had fabricated the entire encounter with Officer Laird, painting her as an opportunist seeking attention. "They're calling you a liar," Marcus said, his voice tight with anger. "And it's spreading fast." Althea handed the phone back to him, her expression calm despite the sting of the words. "This was bound to happen," she said. "The truth is rarely welcomed by those who benefit from lies." Marcus paced the room, his frustration palpable. "We need to respond. Issue a statement. Call out these lies." Althea shook her head. "No. Engaging with them directly only gives them more power. We stick to the facts. Let our actions speak louder than their smears." Marcus hesitated but nodded. He trusted her judgment, even if it went against his instincts. "Then what's our next move?" Althea leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. "We shift the focus back to the issue at hand. This isn't about me. It's about the culture that allowed this to happen. We need to keep the spotlight on that." The next day, Althea held a community forum at a local civic center. The room was packed with people from all walks of life: activists, legal professionals, community leaders, and ordinary citizens. The energy in the room was electric, a mix of anger, hope, and determination. Althea stood at the front of the room, addressing the crowd. "What happened to me at the courthouse was not an isolated incident," she began. "It was a symptom of a larger problem, a system that has perpetuated inequality and discrimination for far too long." She spoke with passion and clarity, drawing on her experiences and the stories of others who had faced similar challenges. The crowd listened intently, nodding in agreement and applauding at key moments. By the time she finished, the room was buzzing with energy. As the forum concluded, a young woman approached her. She was in her early 20s, her eyes bright with determination. "Judge Morgan," she said, "what you're doing is inspiring. My brother was arrested last year for something he didn't do, and no one listened to us. But seeing you stand up, it gives me hope." Althea placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, her voice soft but firm. "Change starts with us," she said. "Your voice matters. Don't stop fighting for what's right." That evening, as Althea returned home, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The resistance was fierce, but so was the support. For every baseless accusation, there was a voice of encouragement. For every threat, there was a story of someone who had been inspired by her courage. The battle was far from over, but Althea was ready. She had spent her life fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to stop now. The fire within her burned brighter than ever, lighting the path forward in a world desperate for change. A system in shadows. The courthouse was quieter than usual the next morning, the atmosphere thick with tension. Judge Althea Morgan could feel it as soon as she stepped inside. The usual hustle and bustle of clerks, lawyers, and visitors seemed muted, their voices hushed as they exchanged glances. She was no stranger to attention. But this felt different, a simmering unease that hung in the air like an unspoken accusation. Her chambers offered little solace. On her desk, a stack of case files awaited her review, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The fallout from her press conference and community forum had been swift. Support poured in from unexpected corners: civil rights organizations, community leaders, and even a few of her colleagues had reached out to commend her courage. But alongside the praise came the backlash. Anonymous threats had increased, each one more insidious than the last. Social media was awash with vitriol, twisting her words and questioning her character. And now, the courthouse itself seemed to have turned against her. Whispers followed her through the halls, and colleagues who once greeted her warmly now avoided her gaze. A sharp knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice steady. Marcus Carter entered, his face a mixture of frustration and determination. "We have a problem," he said, closing the door behind him. Althea raised an eyebrow. "Another one." Marcus handed her a printed document. "This just came through. It's an internal memo from the police department. They're launching a formal investigation into your conduct. They're framing it as a review of your professionalism, following the incident with Officer Laird." Althea scanned the memo, her jaw tightening. The wording was vague, but the intent was clear. This wasn't about professionalism. It was retaliation. "They're trying to discredit me," she said, setting the paper down. "They're hoping to shift the focus away from their own failures." Marcus nodded. "Exactly. And they're using every tool at their disposal. This investigation could tie you up for months, maybe even years." Althea leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had expected resistance, but this was a calculated attack, one designed to erode her credibility and silence her voice. "What's our strategy?" Marcus asked, his eyes searching hers. Althea considered her options. She could fight the investigation head-on, exposing it for the sham it was. But that would mean stepping into a protracted battle, one that could distract from the larger issue. Alternatively, she could use this moment to double down on her message, refusing to be sidelined by their tactics. "We stay the course," she said finally. "We don't let them dictate the narrative. I'll cooperate with the investigation, but we make it clear that this is an attempt to silence me, and that it won't work." Marcus nodded, but his concern was evident. "You're playing a dangerous game, Judge Morgan. They're not going to back down easily." "I know," Althea replied, her voice firm. "But neither am I." The following week, Althea faced her first meeting with the investigators. The hearing room was small and cold, its sterile walls lined with framed certificates and commendations. Across the table sat two officers, their expressions unreadable. Officer Laird was notably absent, though his presence loomed large in the proceedings. The lead investigator, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, opened a file and cleared his throat. "Judge Morgan, thank you for meeting with us. This review is standard procedure, and we appreciate your cooperation." Althea smiled politely, though the words rang hollow. "I'm happy to cooperate, but let's not pretend this is standard. I know exactly what this is." The investigator's eyes flickered, but he maintained his composure. "We're here to gather facts, Judge. Let's start with your account of the incident." Althea recounted the events with precision, her tone calm and measured. She described Officer Laird's hostility, his baseless accusations, and his blatant disregard for her authority. The investigators listened in silence, their pens scratching against their notepads. When she finished, the lead investigator leaned forward. "Do you believe Officer Laird's actions were motivated by racial bias?" Althea met his gaze evenly. "I don't believe it. I know it." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The second investigator, a younger woman with sharp features, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Judge Morgan," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "you've made some serious allegations against Officer Laird and the department as a whole. Do you understand the potential consequences of these statements?" Althea's smile was thin but unwavering. "The truth always has consequences, but I'm not afraid of them. Are you?" The young investigator's face flushed, but she said nothing. The lead investigator cleared his throat, signaling the end of the session. "Thank you for your time, Judge Morgan. We'll be in touch." As Althea left the room, Marcus was waiting for her in the hallway. "How did it go?" he asked. "Exactly as expected," she replied. "They're fishing for ways to undermine me. But I didn't give them anything to work with." Marcus nodded, his expression grim. "Good, because the media's not letting up. The story's everywhere." Althea sighed, the weight of it all pressing down on her. "Let them talk. The more attention this gets, the harder it'll be for them to sweep it under the rug." That evening, Althea attended a town hall meeting organized by local activists. The community had rallied around her, turning her experience into a call to action. The room was packed, the energy palpable. Althea stood before the crowd, her voice steady but impassioned. "What happened to me is not unique," she said. "It's a symptom of a system that has failed to deliver justice for everyone. But we have the power to change that. We have the power to demand better." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the room. As Althea looked out at the sea of faces, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The resistance was fierce, but so was the support. For every attack, there was a voice of encouragement. For every obstacle, there was an opportunity to push forward. The battle was far from over, but Althea was ready. She had spent her life fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to stop now. The fire within her burned brighter than ever, lighting the way forward in a world desperate for change. The turning tide. The weeks following the investigation hearing were a blur of courtroom sessions, community meetings, and relentless media coverage. Judge Althea Morgan had become a polarizing figure, a hero to many, a threat to others. The courthouse, once her sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield, each day presenting new challenges. The formal investigation into her conduct lingered like a storm cloud. Althea complied with every request, but she could sense the maneuvering behind the scenes. The questions weren't about finding the truth. They were about trapping her, twisting her words, and undermining her credibility. She refused to give them the satisfaction. It was a late Friday afternoon when Marcus Carter entered her chambers, holding a folder so thick it looked like it might burst. His expression was triumphant. "I've got it," he said, dropping the folder onto her desk. Althea raised an eyebrow. "Got what?" "Proof," Marcus replied, flipping open the folder. Records of Officer Laird's conduct over the past 5 years. Complaints from citizens, disciplinary actions swept under the rug, and even an internal report recommending his removal that was mysteriously ignored. Althea leaned forward, her eyes scanning the documents. "Where did you get this?" Marcus hesitated. "Let's just say some people in the department aren't thrilled with Laird's behavior either. They want change, and they see you as the catalyst." Althea's lips pressed into a thin line. The documents were damning. They painted a picture of an officer with a history of aggressive and discriminatory behavior, shielded by a system that preferred to protect its own rather than hold them accountable. "This changes everything," Marcus said. "We can use this to expose not just Laird, but the entire culture that enabled him." Althea nodded slowly. "It's a powerful weapon," she agreed, "but we need to use it wisely." That evening, Althea held a press conference outside the courthouse. The steps were packed with reporters, cameras flashing as she approached the podium. Marcus stood beside her, holding the folder like a shield. "Good evening," Althea began, her voice steady. "For weeks now, I have been the target of an investigation designed to silence me and discredit my experiences. But tonight, I want to shift the focus back to where it belongs." She gestured to Marcus, who handed her a single sheet of paper from the folder. "This is an excerpt from an internal police report filed 2 years ago. It details a pattern of misconduct by Officer Laird, including instances of racial bias, excessive force, and abuse of authority. This report recommended disciplinary action, but no action was taken. Instead, Officer Laird was allowed to continue serving, unchecked." The crowd murmured, the weight of her words sinking in. Althea continued, her voice growing stronger. "This is not just about one officer. It is about a system that prioritizes loyalty over accountability, silence over justice. And this is why I refuse to back down. Because if we do not challenge this system, it will continue to fail the very people it is meant to serve." As she stepped away from the podium, the reporters erupted with questions. Althea didn't answer them. She had said what needed to be said. The fallout was immediate. The leaked documents sparked outrage, both within the community and beyond. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, demanding not only Officer Laird's removal, but a complete overhaul of the police department's policies and leadership. Social media buzzed with hashtags supporting Althea and calling for systemic change. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. Some of Althea's colleagues supported her openly, while others kept their distance, wary of being associated with the growing controversy. The chief judge summoned her to a private meeting, his face a mask of controlled frustration. "Judge Morgan," he began, "you've put this courthouse at the center of a storm. This kind of attention isn't good for anyone. Althea met his gaze, unflinching. "This courthouse is supposed to be a beacon of justice," she replied. "If attention is what it takes to ensure that, then so be it." The chief judge sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're walking a fine line. Just be careful it doesn't cost you more than you're willing to pay." Days later, the tide began to turn. Officer Laird was suspended pending a formal review, and the police chief announced a task force to address the issues Althea had raised. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. At the same time, the investigation into Althea's conduct was quietly dropped. The department had no evidence to support its claims, and public pressure made it impossible to continue without looking petty and vindictive. But Althea knew the fight was far from over. Systemic change wasn't achieved through one battle. It required sustained effort, resilience, and a willingness to face setbacks. She had become a symbol of that fight, and she intended to honor it. One evening, as Althea sat in her chambers reviewing cases, Marcus entered with a smile. "There's someone here to see you," he said. Before she could respond, a young woman stepped into the room. Althea recognized her from the town hall weeks earlier, the woman who had shared her brother's story. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling. "Because of you, people are listening now. My brother's case is being reviewed. For the first time, it feels like there's hope." Althea stood, her chest tightening with emotion. She extended her hand, but the woman pulled her into an embrace. "Thank you," she whispered. As the woman left, Althea sat back down, her heart full. The path she had chosen was not an easy one, but moments like this reminded her why it was worth it. The fight for justice was far from over, but Althea Morgan was ready. She had faced the shadows within the system and come out stronger. And with every step forward, she knew she was not walking alone. Together, they would continue to shine a light on the darkness, pushing for a future where justice truly served all.